Secretary Bell and I first discussed a plan of action to deal with the declining quality of education in America, we agreed that it was imperative to assemble a panel of America's leading educators, an assembly of such eminence that the nation would listen to its findings.
The report states bluntly that the very future of our nation is at risk, sabotaged by a rising tide of mediocrity in our children's education.
Your commission was asked to assess the quality of teaching and learning in America compared with our own educational tradition and the rising competition from other industrial nations. We've taken a long, hard look at America's educational system and found that quality is lacking, but not because today's students are any less capable than their predecessors. We found that our educational system is in the grip of a crisis caused by low standards, lack of purpose, ineffective use of resources, and a failure to challenge students to push performance to the boundaries of individual ability, and that is to strive for excellence.
A Nation at Risk was probably the single most influential document in the history of American education.
Well, it was a bombshell. A Nation at Risk hit the country and it exploded. And I think that was against expectations.
I mean, if you think about it, it was just a report, just a few words, and we remember it well today, and it challenged a lot of us. It wasn't a 2,000-page piece of legislation with 50 programs in it and lots of mandates and rules and regulation. One might argue that A Nation at Risk and that phrase did more than all the federal legislation that we've passed.
When that report came out, it became a headline maker, to the surprise of many people. It was the #1 story in papers like the New York Times, and we had made it short enough, a 31-page report, so that it could be reprinted. And so we began a national conversation about the quality of education and the quality of schooling in this country.
Well, the significance of A Nation at Risk is that it set in motion a false narrative. It set in motion the claim that American education was failing. And the great irony of this is that American society, by every measure you can think of, is the strongest and most powerful in the world.
A Nation at Risk called for us to attend to the needs of all our children in much more powerful, more accountable ways. It asked us to look at our schools not just as an institution and as an employer and as a community institution, but literally how well were we doing by our students.
It stirred a lot of people into action, and it was, I think, a great rallying point for people who wanted to engage in school reform.
It was a scathing indictment of the quality of education in this country, including the course-taking patterns of youngsters and the quality of teaching in America and the quality of administration, and generally a negative appraisal of where we were.
I think A Nation at Risk is like a lot of things in education. It's more significant as a touchstone and what it represents than what was actually between the covers.
A lot of other reports were coming out at about the same time saying much the same thing. So in reality, A Nation at Risk was kind of the biggest wave in a wavy ocean.
And I think there was a level of truthfulness there that was very appealing to me. There was not a sugarcoating. It was not politically correct. I think there were folks in the political establishment who didn't want the report to come out, but the fact that they talked about the good, the bad, and the ugly, I think is so important.
They were wrong. Their predictions were all wrong. And I think that the alarmist rhetoric, which it's at the time, it seemed to me the alarmist rhetoric was just a wake-up call. It was a way of using language that was overheated to kind of get attention. But it had real-world consequences. For one thing, it began the long march to destroy public education, which I think is now in full flower.
Most of what it had to say was about high schools, but if you read the rhetoric and the releases and you would have no idea that most of what they were talking about only applied to grades 9 to 12.
The administration did not come in 1980 thinking about how do we unleash a transformation of American schools, and it wasn't sort of a top priority for President Reagan. It was a report that got underway. It was there, and there was even disagreements at the senior staff level at the White House about what to do about it. And then the report was released.
Up until 1983, the conversation for many years was mostly around issues of equity, and were also big issues around race and desegregation, which of course were incredibly important. That there was a whole era of what you might call education reform, since Brown versus Board of Education, that was all about desegregating the schools. Suddenly we woke up and realized that SAT scores were plummeting and that students were learning a lot less than they had before. So this was a wake-up call to say, we need a new focus around excellence, around achievement, around results. And 30 years later, it's still the focus that we've got today.
It was an absolutely clear and courageous call to challenge the status quo and not to accept where we were and to not think if we continued on that path that everything would be okay. And I think there's still, frankly, a sense of complacency, a lack of urgency that we continue to fight. And so I think the authors' strong desire was to challenge us to do better, to get better faster. And as much as they felt that 30 years ago, I absolutely feel that every single day today.
I think our schools look remarkably like they did in 1983. The way we hire, use teachers, pay teachers, deploy teachers, evaluate teachers, the way we organize schools, the way we organize classrooms, bell schedule, adopt textbooks. We have gone through several spins of the standard cycle. We have school choice that looks nothing like what one could have imagined in the early 1980s. There are entrepreneurial ventures and various kinds of nonprofit providers in the charter school space and the teacher space who were unimaginable, literally unimaginable in the early 1980s. And for me, these are all incremental steps forward. But, you know, in the scheme of things, you know, if we were on our own 20-yard line in 1983, you know, I'd probably say we're on the 25 or 26-yard line 30 years later.
I think that what Nation at Risk challenged us to do was to take to scale things that we know matter. And, you know, in a nation of 15,000 school districts and, you know, tremendous decentralization and a relatively small federal role compared to other nations, the question is how do we maximize our resources to drive the kind of fundamental systemic change that we need?
I'd say where we have made progress potentially is the fact that the idea of education reform has hit the mainstream more.
The one clear positive or impact of A Nation at Risk is that people no longer think we're that great. I mean, at that time, you know, everybody thought we were great. So the bubble has been burst on the on that inflated view of ourselves. So that's a good thing.
I think there are places that we can point to real progress. When you look at the National Assessment of Educational Progress, at least if you look at the 4th grade and 8th grade results, there have been some big improvements. This happened especially in the 90s, has continued somewhat through to today. It is especially the case for low-income students, minority students, our lowest achieving students, that the focus of standards-based reform and testing, and then No Child Left Behind, all of that has worked to some degree to bring up the lowest achieving students, and we should be proud of that progress.
We are not living up to our promise as a country to be the land of opportunity, to be the place where everybody can get an excellent education and live the American dream, because the bottom line is that if you are a poor kid in this country, or you are an African American or Latino kid in this country, the likelihood that you are attending a failing school is pretty significant, and therefore you can't get a high quality education. You can't become the chances that you could become a productive member of society are lessened because of that, and I think that goes against the ideals that we have as a nation.
One of the things A Nation at Risk did was to put into the atmosphere this absolutely ridiculous idea that schools alone can change society, and that we could ignore poverty, ignore all the factors that affect children and their ability to learn, and to say that the schools alone can bring everybody up to high levels of proficiency. It's never happened in any other country. It hasn't happened here. We now have a status quo of testing, accountability, and choice. The charter movement after 20 years has nothing to show for it. It has some good schools, some horrible schools, a lot of corruption, a lot of fraud, a lot of misuse, and lack of accountability.
It did start that conversation about having higher expectations, more demanding courses. The idea that, look, it shouldn't just be college track kids who can take this more demanding material. It hinted at choice, though it wasn't a big part of the conversation. But when Secretary of Education William Bennett came in soon after A Nation at Risk, that was a big issue for him. He had his 3 C's, the content, character, and choice. And I think it was Bennett and his boss, President Reagan, who really put choice on the agenda.
I think content was the main thrust of The Nation at Risk, and I'm happy to say I borrowed from it, though I don't know that I did consciously. But what it talked about was that students didn't have the proper background, the proper understanding of the key disciplines, math, English, history, science, art, and music, and that they needed to know more and to study more.
We now really do judge a school by whether its students are learning, rather than by how much money is going into it, or what its programs look like, or its good intentions, or its TLC. That's a profound change in how we view schools. We're serious about standards, we're serious about quality, we're serious about benchmarking ourselves, states against states, school against school, country against country. This is all new and is very important, but what do we still have to do? We still have to get a whole lot more skills and knowledge into the skulls of many millions more young people.
I mean, if you look, we've taken some really huge steps against some big opposition. I mean, it took me a year and a half in a big fight with the largest teachers union to have just the Model T of paying teachers more for teaching well. But today we have teacher evaluation systems being tried everywhere in the country. We have many more children with choices of different kinds of schools. We have charter schools, which didn't even exist in as late as 1990 or 1991. So we understand a lot of the problems.
What the writers of A Nation at Risk had in mind was we want higher standards, we want better schools, we want a stronger public education system. It has become, however, over time, over 30 years, the founding document of the privatization movement. And so in that sense, it was very powerful for school reform in a positive sense. It has become very powerful in a negative sense as the basis for privatization and for the enrichment of a small number of entrepreneurs.
I'm a deep believer that good standards is where education quality starts. Unfortunately, it's not where it ends, because if they're not taught to and so on, they don't do much good. But having a good destination for what you'd like your kids to have learned by the end of 12th grade, and then every grade before that, is a whole lot better than having a bad destination in mind. Having said that, most states, left to their own devices, have come up with abysmal standards. And the Common Core folks have come up with good standards. And so when we did this analysis at Fordham a couple of years ago, we concluded that about 3/4 of the children in America would in fact be better off if their states moved toward the Common Core. It's up to the states whether to do this, but the fact of the matter is that for 3/4 of the kids in America, what is expected of them in the Common Core is superior to what is expected of them in the standards of the states that existed before.
We've seen 46 states just in the past couple of years raise standards, college or career ready, internationally benchmarked. That people thought was impossible, thought it couldn't happen for a whole host of reasons across the political divide, and to see that kind of movement, frankly, nobody predicted. So the lessons from A Nation at Risk, their call to action, but again, frankly, the lack of action subsequent to that, was that influential in our thinking? Absolutely. Thinking about how we continue to challenge the status quo where we have underperforming schools and turning them around. Very, very important. But we have to raise the bar for everybody. And if you're closing gaps, but everyone's going to a spot of mediocrity, which is what the Nation at Risk talked about, that's not going to help our country get where we need to go. That's not going to keep us competitive. That's not going to keep good jobs in this country. So combining equity, and again, I always try and talk not about achievement gaps, but about opportunity gaps, combining equity with a desire to raise the bar for everyone, equity and excellence, and getting the public to see that those two values aren't in conflict, but in fact are mutually reinforcing. I think that's the only way we get to where we need to as a nation.
Well, we have plenty of work to do because our outcomes aren't anywhere near where they need to be, and the rest of the world is not waiting for us. It is accelerating as fast as it can, and in some cases moving faster than we are. to improve. So we are by no means out of the woods on this problem.
I think there needs to be a continuing growth of reality. Even though A Nation at Risk was an alarm bell, and people said, yeah, you know what, we're not doing as well as we should, it doesn't last very long. They're not outraged over it. And sometimes they even get into the, well, we're doing okay, you know, economy's okay, so forth and so on. So it is within our means, but we have a long way to go.
I think we've made a mistake in the reform movement to be obsessed with getting more young people into college, for example. We've had very little focus on preparing students for career with good vocational or technical education, to get credentials that could help them do well in the world of work. These are the kinds of things we need to be focused on so that the middle class and the working class going forward can reap some of the benefits that the more affluent Americans have gained in the last 30 years as well.
My hope is that we really do take seriously what kids should know and be able to do. It's definable.
As a friend of mine said once, the longer you stay in school in America, the dumber you get relative to kids in other countries. Our international standing is not where it should be, and we are, if we were to use the language of that report, still a nation at risk. The risk now is that we're not preparing our students for the kind of competition they're facing.
I think the more we can spell out who's responsible for doing what, talking not just about achievement gaps, but what I call opportunity gaps, I think there's so much more we know now. But for me, at the end of the day, yes, reports are important. Yes, reports draw a line in the sand. Any report, unless it leads to actual changes in behavior, unless it leads to action, unless it leads to real implementation, as intellectually interesting as they might be, if they're not doing those other things, they're not changing our young people's lives the way we need to do.
I think we're at a real crossroads in American education. I think 30 years from now, one of two things will have happened. Either the technology and the infrastructure and the lack of containment around knowledge will really revolutionize our schools. We'll see our best teachers doing the hardest work. We'll see students working at their own paces. We'll see curriculum aligned to their needs. And I think it will be a very, very bright future for American public education. On the other side of the coin, I think it's also possible that this institution will really degrade significantly. I think knowledge can no longer be contained within four walls. Technology has really brought information to people in more powerful ways, and I think we're going to see the potential for our schools to no longer exist as we think of them in 30 years. That knowledge will be outside, it will be privatized, it will be homeschooling, it will be, at your fingertips, and the institution we know today as public education may be a shadow of its former self.
What I'm working towards with whatever years I have left in my life is to save public education and to make public education what it ought to be, which is a good high-quality school in every neighborhood, schools that have small class sizes so that the needs of children are met, schools that have a social worker, a guidance counselor, a psychologist, a librarian, a library, schools that have a full curriculum with history and civics and foreign languages, physical education every day, a vibrant program of the arts, schools that strive to give to every child the same advantages that people get if they pay for a private school education.
Well, hopefully we will be a country that's living up to our promise. Hopefully we will be a nation that if you look at the achievement levels of a school, you can't then say, well, I'm pretty sure I know the demographics of this school, right? Because right now there is such a high correlation, and that's part of the problem. We want this country to be a place where you look at the academic outcomes of kids, and you can't, based on that, make assumptions about what those kids look like or where they live.
What I hope is that our K through 12 education system looks more like our higher education system. By that I mean that we have thousands of autonomous schools. We can call them charter schools. Most of them will be public. And that parents have broad choices among those schools so the school can fit the child, just like we do when we pick colleges and universities. I'd like to see us over the next 30 years, particularly taking advantage of all that the states have done, to begin to move decision-making back out of Washington and let the federal role for education be more like a nation at risk.
Philanthropy's got a role to play. Policy advocates have a role to play. Entrepreneurs, including for-profits, have a big role to play. And you know what? We've got to understand that it's a big, messy, complicated world. And it's going to be another century and another 2 centuries, and we're still going to be massively dissatisfied with the quality of our schools. So rather than ask, you know, can we create, you know, this miraculous system of schooling that we imagine somebody else has, and can we create it tomorrow? We're just going to have to settle in for the long haul, like it or not.
What I think it's done is induce a kind of culture shift or a shift in basic assumptions. It's almost as if the wallpaper had been changed. And we don't have to talk about the new wallpaper after we've lived with it for a few years. But indeed, we're still living with it. So I don't think you'll hear, except on anniversaries and so on, I don't think you'll hear Secretary Duncan or Margaret Spellings or Rod Page talking very often about a nation at risk. But what they spend their day trying to accomplish has been very heavily influenced by it and its legacy.
We're entering a new era, and education holds the key. As sunrise industries grow, they bring us technological advances, offering opportunities and challenges. Rather than fear our future, let us embrace it and make it work for us by improving instruction in science and math, retraining our workers, encouraging their continued education, retooling our factories, and stimulating investment in new areas of growth. We can do that. We can compete and meet the challenges of the marketplace. We're still the world's technological leader. But to be stronger, we have to get smarter. America needs more education power.